So this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing our reading of Volume 2 of Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. We're on the sort of mini book, History of the Notion of the Individual. And then last time we finished the section on Descartes. So we looked at, a few different things, but so one of them was this notion of a provisional morality, which Descartes proposes. So there's this idea that ultimately we would want to have our system of ethics or morals to be sort of founded on the science of the human being and the way that the world is constituted and so on. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for the science to be completed, we still have to act in the world. We have to decide, where we want to live, what we want to do for a living, what political forces we want to support or oppose, and so on. We have to make decisions without having all of the knowledge that would allow for a completely rational decision. And so Descartes proposes a few sort of principles for decision in light of uncertainty. So making a decision without having the knowledge that you would need to sort of completely decide. So that we saw that a little bit, and then we also saw the bit about sorry, I'm just trying to find it here. The bit about the transmission of evidence, which Simondon, we've seen this in some other texts from Simondon, but there's this sort of the way that Descartes constructs his system is to start from something indubitable, something that is not subject to doubt, which is the cogito, and then perform these deductive chains of deductions. Starting from this foundation that is this unshakable foundation, and then having a transmission of evidence from one link to the next in this chain of arguments. And so the idea is that we develop this complete system of knowledge that is completely certain because it's founded on this immediate certainty of the cogito, and then each link in the chain is transmits that certainty to the next link in the chain. So that's another bit about Descartes that we saw last time. And then we also talked about probably the central difficulty for Descartes, which is to account for the relationship between the body and the soul. The body is a piece of extended thing of the res extensa. It's the body is a kind of machine. The heart is a kind of furnace that heats up the blood and so on. Every part of the body is just a mechanical apparatus of some kind, and the soul is inextended, and it's so how exactly? So they're two completely heterogeneous substances. There's no similarity between them, but somehow we're aware of the way that our soul is capable of acting on the body by causing voluntary motion. So I decide to walk across the room, and the machine of my body acts in such a way that I walk across the room. And then, of course, in the other direction, we have perception, where our body is affected by other bodies in the environment, and then our soul forms the idea of the piece of wax or whatever other body surrounding us. And so how exactly this interaction is supposed to happen is something that Descartes ultimately says is beyond human understanding. He thinks that God unites the human soul and the human body in a way that we can't understand. We just have to sort of accept that it exists, and that's the sort of end of our inquiry. He also gives these not quite explanations, but these sort of ideas of how this interaction would happen, and they have to do with the pineal gland, which is a small gland within the brain. And so Descartes thinks that this is the location where this interaction happens. And his sort of trick for accounting for for this interaction is that the quantity of motion in the world of extension is fixed, is conserved in all interactions. So whenever a particle hits another particle, the total quantity of motion stays the same, but the direction of motion can vary. So when a particle hits another particle, the two particles will bounce off each other in opposite directions. And so, what Descartes says the operation of the soul in the pineal gland is this sort of changing the direction of motion of the animal spirits that fill up our nerves. So it's a kind of hydraulic model of the functioning of the human body, and so the soul, in some mysterious way, operates to change the direction of motion of the animal spirits in our nerves, which then cause our muscles to contract and cause our body to perform various motions. And so this is Descartes' sort of schema for how the soul acts on the body. But then Simondon points out that this schema only really allows for one-way interaction, even if we sort of gloss over the problem of how the soul is supposed to act on the body in the first place. But it takes the form of what he calls a relay. So an apparatus, a technical device that allows for the control of a larger quantity of energy by a small quantity of energy. So you can think of like the way that the rudder on a ship sort of directs the motion of the ship with a very small amount of energy compared to the energy that that is required to move the ship as a whole. But then the motion in the opposite, or the influence of going in the opposite direction, is impossible to understand, because the whole point of a relay is that it controls the small amount of energy controls the larger amount of energy. And if you had influence going in the other direction, then that control function would not be possible anymore. So Descartes' schema ultimately doesn't allow us to understand the how the soul can be affected by the body in perception. And so this is sort of the core difficulty of the Cartesian system. And we'll see, I think, a little bit today in the Spinoza section that overcoming this difficulty was one of the key problems that was posed for post-Cartesian philosophy. I think that's all I wanted to talk about for the Descartes section that we saw last week. So maybe we can jump into the Pascal section if someone else would like to read the first bit.
Yeah, I can read the first page or so. Pascal. For Pascal, the problem's principle of intelligibility is no longer a reality given among the terms of the position of the problem. Man brings to the problem to be resolved the invention of a notion that is not intelligible by itself, but confers intelligibility to the problem. This new notion contributed by the individual being does not emerge from a position of the problem alone. Here the homogeneity and continuity supposed by Descartes are replaced with a discontinuity, a plurality, the heterogeneity that require for each problem an action of invention on the part of the human individual. This human individual is the being who can comprehend the position of a problem and contribute this singular notion that creates intelligibility. Dependent on an invention, intelligibility is not contained in the elements of reality constituting the problem. The individual therefore plays a role that does not make him tend toward universality. On the contrary, there is something unique and irreplaceable in every invention, and the individual who invents it is in some fashion the man of this problem. The act of invention appears in the extreme particularity of the individual who has posed the problem to himself by knowing all the circumstances without omitting any of them. There is, so to speak, a particular world for each problem, and there is something infinite about each problem. Method is particular and cannot be applicable to all problems, for every problem has this aspect of a universe that excludes all other universes actually. Consequently, the individual contributes more than an activity of clarification. He contributes something original in particular that isolates him from other individuals, at least at the instant in which he contributes a solution to a problem. There no longer exists a unity of method depending on the unity of the intellect. In order for a mind to be fruitful within its domain, it must be exclusive. Quote, it is rare that geometers are acute men or acute men geometers, unquote. Each direction of the mind requires different gifts, and each problem calls for a particular direction of the mind in which it must be engaged. Thus, for each problem, there appears through invention a particular notion that is an elaboration of the individual strictly relative to the problem. The problem of conic sections is resolved by the invention of the quote-unquote mystic hexagram, which is a hexagon that allows for the deduction of all the properties of conic sections. Similarly, the consideration of triangular numbers makes it possible to find the center of gravity of the cycloid and of the surfaces or volumes that depend on this curve. What constitutes the method proper to each problem is this perception of the rapport between the triangular numbers and the question of the cycloid's center of gravity, or between the mystic hexagram and the properties of conic sections. Yet this method is proper to the individual being who has made an effort to discover the notion whose rapport to the terms of the problem contributes the solution. To perceive this relation, the notion must have been invented or be capable of being invented again. Unlike in Descartes, here there is no longer a construction due to a transfer of evidence. This constructive addition of the known to the unknown to go toward the unknown, of the known to the known to go toward the unknown, is no longer possible. Relative to the terms of the problem, invention is a leap, an absolute initiative that requires individual singularity. Parts of this sort of sound like the way that Simondon talks about the resolution of a problem in Volume 1, in the sense that there's in resolving a problematic, whether it's a perceptive problematic or an effective problematic, the individual is always called into question as well. And the resolution of the problematic involves the kind of co-creation of the solution and the individual as the solver of the problem. But I don't know how it seems like maybe Pascal puts more of an emphasis on the singularity and the, I don't know, non-transferability of the solution of the problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Pascal has this notion of the leap that Simondon points to here is key for Pascal. And we'll see a little bit more on this later in the text on Pascal. But there's of course the famous wager, Pascal's wager, where you have to sort of make a leap in faith in God. You can't. There's no purely rational argument that can convince the atheist to believe in God, but you have to take a sort of leap of faith, and I think that aspect is something that Simondon is a little less sort of willing to accept than Pascal was. So I think for Simondon, the act of invention is not so much a leap as a sort of transformation of what already exists. So, like in Pascal, solving a problem is a kind of radical newness or radical creation of something new. In a way that for Simondon, it's not quite the same. It's more of a transformation of what already exists. Like in the famous or the standard example that he uses, where the disparation of the retinal images leads to the invention of depth perception. So here, what we perceive in binocular vision is not something completely different and new in comparison to monocular vision. It's a sort of transformation of the dimensions of the problem that preserves what was already present in the in monocular vision. And so I think that's part of where Simondon would distinguish himself from Pascal is that aspect of preservation of what was contained in the problem, as opposed to sort of transcending it completely, like in Pascal. And I put a link in the chat here if anyone's interested to look at these mystic hexagrams. It's a sort of well, anyway, it's a mathematical procedure that Pascal invented. It's maybe not quite as Pascal is not quite as famous as Descartes for his mathematical work, but he was an important figure in the history of mathematics in the 17th century as well. And he made discoveries in geometry, and he also was one of the founders of what eventually became probability theory. So yeah, he's made important mathematical contributions as well. And he's not just the guy that came up with this wager. There's more to his work than that.
He also sort of come up with an early form of a mechanical calculator.
Yes, he did. I don't know a lot about that, but yeah, he developed a mechanical adding machine of some kind, and it I think Leibniz either saw it or read about it somewhere, and that was part of his motivation for thinking of uh, you know thinking of thinking as a kind of calculation. And coming up with the idea of a universal calculative language. And so these are, of course, precursors to like the computational theory of mind and the development of computation in the 20th century. So yeah, Pascal is uh, part of the intellectual tradition that leads up to the creation of computers in the 20th century. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. If someone else would like to read, I think we're at dependent on an invention. Someone can pick up from there, or if there's no volunteers, I can read from there. Okay, I'll read. Dependent on an invention, intelligibility is not contained in the elements of reality constituting the problem. The individual therefore plays a role that does not make him tend toward universality. On the contrary, there is something unique and irreplaceable in every invention, and the individual who invents is in some fashion the man of this problem. The act of invention appears in the extreme particularity of the individual. Oh, sorry, am I rereading what we already read? Yes, I am. Sorry. Where are we?
Uh, Sorry, I was zoned out for a second. I think we're at the advent of invention as opposed to Cartesian
Right.
progress.
Sorry, I was on the wrong page. Okay, let me restart. Lath Mason, if you're editing this afterwards, you can edit that part out so it sounds better. Okay, the advent of invention is opposed to Cartesian progress. Only the method of decision in Descartes' provisional morality has something in common with this act of invention in Pascal. For Pascal, there are several orders, while for Descartes the real is continuous. Between Descartes' method and Pascal's methods, there is a difference that opposes construction and invention. Construction is continued by a progressive and uninterrupted operation, while invention supposes the existence of a potential that abruptly actualizes into structure. The conception of individual time is opposed in Descartes and in Pascal. For Descartes, there is no potential. Each instant is fully contained within its own limits. For Pascal, alongside the apparent actuality of each instant, there is a potential that operates a straddling of instants upon one another and bursts into invention. The individual is this being who is capable of invention. The elements of a problem are nothing but a rapport between actual terms. It is through the invention of this potential that an individual can resolve a problem. When Pascal applies his thought and his life to the problem of man, this is to pass from man considered as an actual being, who is consequently a monster, a chimera, to man as a being who harbors potentials and who does not have within himself, i.e., in his actuality, the entirety of his explanation. The reality of Christ does not intervene from outside as one fact among others, no more than it intervenes from inside, like the idea of the infinite and the perfect that refers to its author. Christ's reality corresponds to the existence of these human potentials that are not in harmony with the actual reality of man. This is why neither sacred history nor philosophical proofs nor the teachings of the Church are sufficient or useful to contemplate at the start. Only the ignorance of these potentials impedes the position of the problem. Only the brute stupidity or sheer blindness that conceal these potentials must be eradicated. What must be defeated is distraction, for it saps these potentials that form and guarantees that they never reach a sufficient level to produce invention. Distraction is what leads man to live in the most actual and instantaneous way possible to avoid the formation of these potentials. Reasoning is powerless to show the value of the Catholic religion. Quote, metaphysical proofs are so far removed from men's reasoning and so complicated that they have little force, and when they do help some people, it is only at the moment when they see this demonstration, but an hour later they are afraid of having made a mistake. Unquote. This is because reasoning is merely actual. It can neither express nor elicit these potentials, which are the essence of real individuality. Only a certain mode of intuition is adequate for these potentials. Traditional proofs are not deprived of value, but their effectiveness to a certain extent is contingent on a first invention or purely individual discovery that can only exist through the actualization of one of these potentials. The most concrete and simplest way to lead men to become aware of these potentials is to make him desire the truth of the Christian religion. Instead of discovering men according to a chain of reasons that are all actual and equal in the modality of the propositions that formulate them, Pascal seeks to concentrate everything that man knows about himself within a unique experience, wherein he will simultaneously know himself in all his aspects. This is how potential forms. Everything that prematurely discharges this potential must be removed, and most particularly the expression to others, description. Right. There's a point of translation here that I wanted to mention. So in the English text, he talks about distraction, and yeah, I'm not sure that's exactly the best translation, but we sometimes talk about uh, you know. So it doesn't have the meaning here of distraction in the sense of not paying attention to your work or something like that. It has to do with we sometimes call entertainment distractions that we engage in, and so what Pascal is talking about here in when he talks about these distractions are like he talks about how noblemen in his time would spend their time hunting or uh, playing tennis or something like that. They sort of engage in these activities that don't have any sort of lasting value. Their only function is to provide enjoyment for the time in which you're engaging in that activity. And Pascal sees these kinds of activities as very dangerous in the sense that they sort of hide from ourselves the condition of the human being without God. And so the condition of the human being without God is one of a kind of misery. And this is made apparent by the fact that we can't really stand to be alone with ourselves for an hour. If you just, uh, anytime that you have to wait, I don't know, you have an appointment or something, you have to wait for an hour, you're waiting for the bus or something like that. The fact that we find this experience of just being alone with ourselves difficult and painful is a kind of sign for Pascal that the human being without God is in a state of misery, and so this condition, even though it's something that we experience as a kind of suffering, is a valuable one because it leads us to desire to overcome this condition. Whereas when we sort of occupy ourselves with these distractions, we sort of paper over the misery in which we live as human beings, and we don't have that same motivation to try to overcome the human condition by knowledge of God.
Sort of reminded me of the brief discussion in the second in collective individuation section of volume 1 of sin, and how he talks about the experience of sin as being really temptation of sin as being something that is destructive of the condition that is necessary to reach the trans-individual life. And in this way that Pascal talks about distraction, or the way Simondon frames it in terms of potential, seems somewhat similar to.
Yeah, I think are you thinking of the passage where Simondon in volume 1 talked about the sort of exteriorization of the principle of sort of falling, that the exteriorization into the figure of the devil or some sort of
Yes.
yeah, okay. Yeah, so there was that passage where Simondon talks about how we have this experience, or there's a sort of common human understanding of ourselves as having both the potential to sort of surpass ourselves and exceed where we are now. We always have this sort of feeling of being able to do more or do better or be a better person or something like that. But then we also have this experience or this feeling of sort of falling below the level of which we're capable of, succumbing to temptation, and uh, and um, and then there's a tendency to treat that second experience or that second feeling as something external to us, as if we're sort of uh, being tempted by some other entity, the devil, or some sort of principle of sin or vice or whatever, that sort of leads us to temptation and leads us into not fulfilling our potential. And so, yeah, I think this bit about Pascal, so this bit about the potential is Simondon's sort of interpretation. It's not a term that Pascal himself uses, as far as I've seen. Um, but yeah, I think there's a similar notion here of distraction as something that sort of leads us away from being able to realize our potential, as opposed to sort of holding on to the state of or holding on to that experience of misery in which the human being is, and using that as a motivation to overcome ourselves and overcome our state of misery. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. If someone else would like to read, I think, yeah, we can read to the end of the section, which is one big paragraph.
Oh, I can read. So, the most concrete, simplest way. I know that's not if Montaigne, right? That's the part, right?
Yes, exactly.
But Montaigne's project to depict himself is a foolish project. That's because this self-expression is falsely equivalent to a justification of the whole desire of searching and of discovery that there is in an individual being. It seems like we could just to be able to depict ourselves. Montaigne leads to a nonchalance about salvation without fear and without repentance. End of quote. Through complacency in oneself. In the same way, Pascal refused the everyday satisfactions of existence, such as a mother embracing her children and all ordinary pleasures in general, even besides those without any hazardous effects, because without restlessness, they lead to being a heathen, frank. It takes a total experience all in one piece. Stoics and Epicureans hinder more than serve the knowledge of men because they simplify the vision and consequently destroy the whole character of attention. To see the greatness of man without seeing his weakness, to see his weakness without seeing his greatness, is much more than to be led astray. It is to conceal to oneself and to conceal to others the fact that man cannot be considered without recognizing his enigmatic and incomprehensible nature. It is not to conserve the tension that results from his incoherence. There is never a truth about man, merely problems, i.e., couples of opposite and incompatible truth. This incoherence concerns us with respect to what is most profound about us. It removes from our moral life every firm point, every assurance, both the confidence of the Stoic and the nonchalance of the skeptic, leaving us terrified and without a center, or rather, without an actuality upon which we could establish knowledge and action. Quote, what a chimera then is a man, what a novelty, what a monster, what a chaos, what a contradiction, what a prodigy, judge of all things, imbecile worm of the earth, dispository of truth, a sink of uncertainty and error, the pride and refuse the universe. End of quote. This contradiction could be removed by a metaphysics of mediation, like the one which founds Orphism, if actual participation in the world could be a solution. But the very terms of the problem exclude every solution that would only address the actual nature of man. However, the vision of the universe elaborated by the Renaissance permits nothing but an actual rapport and excludes the conception of a world that would be a reservoir of potentials. Man is consequently reduced to himself. It is at this point that these potentials seem to Pascal to be arranged in the supernatural destiny of man revealed by Christianity. Greatness, wretchedness, hope of salvation come from a divine origin, from Christ's misery and redemption. The station procession conversion rhythm takes on a meaning for man and explains him. The wager would have no value without this existence of potentials in man. For a man who would have no desire and no lack of satisfaction, the wager would not be endowed with any force. The wager must lead us to desire and to become aware of the fact that we desire. So, the Pascal, it's quite interesting. Like Pascal seems very revolutionary compared to Descartes, but at the same time, he couldn't be free from the frame of Christianity, like the word of God.
Pascal is a sort of a strange figure that there's a sort of quasi-existentialist aspect to Pascal. His sort of criticism or his appreciation for like a kind of meaninglessness in human life is something that we can sort of compare to some 20th century existentialist writers. And his sense, he has a very strong sense of sort of the meaninglessness of human endeavors. But then he also, at the same time, has this desire to sort of overcome that meaninglessness through religion, which is probably a lot less sort of compatible with 20th and 21st century sensibilities. It's a lot harder to, I think, sort of see yourself in that same situation compared to some of his other writings about the meaninglessness of human endeavors. There's one point, yeah, so I just mentioned this in the chat as well. One point of translation, which I think is a mistake here. This bit towards the beginning of that paragraph, where in the translation it says that the everyday satisfactions of existence lead to being a heathen Frank. I think that heathen Frank should instead be something like an outright heathen or a straightforward heathen or something like that. So the thought is that sort of allowing oneself to indulge in these everyday pleasures, even if they aren't sinful pleasures, they're sort of permissible pleasures. It's it allows for ourselves to sort of take our satisfaction or take our satisfaction, I guess is the best word, in the world. So to sort of find the reason for our existence or the meaning of our existence to be something worldly, as opposed to what Pascal takes to be the better approach is to find the meaning of our existence in something outside the world, namely in God. And so even submitting to these sort of harmless pleasures is a kind of distraction from the misery of human existence and turning away from the need for us to be saved and to be saved by God and to surpass the world.
So it sounds religious, and then the first part of this Pascal section, he seemed to really emphasize the importance of singularity and so on. So kind of like individuality actually, but compared to Descartes, actually the part Angus read is homogeneity, continuity of Descartes. I mean, had changed it to like emphasizes plurality, heterogeneity, something like that. And then the latter part is more like, I don't know. We should do like just like heading towards the way of God, something like that. It's like more like a universality. It's not, as you point out, it's kind of really it looks a little contradictory. And no, maybe not. Some parts really new, something new and fresh. But at the same time, he couldn't. He is a kind of part of that time, right?
Yeah, I think the way that Pascal would understand the religious aspect or the turning towards God and so on, I think for Pascal this is not something he would understand as being general or universal in that sense. It's still a kind of singularity. So each of us as a singular individual is called towards God. We each have to make that decision for ourselves to turn towards God, and so there's still a singularity in the sense that it's a singular person that has to make that decision. We can't just sort of rely on like our sort of ambient culture of living in a Christian society and sort of assume that that's sufficient to save us. We have to actually make that decision for ourselves. And so, yeah, I think that aspect for Pascal is still one of singularity as opposed to generality.
Oh, okay.
Whether or not we want to sort of agree with that, but is a second question, but I think that's how Pascal would understand it.
So there are so many various ways to get to to God, right? That's kind of the idea, with very singular, diverse ways according to each individual's potential, and then but the end is kind of same, like to the God, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. The actual sort of historical events that lead one person to turn towards God might be completely different than the set of events that leads another person to turn towards God. And so there's like a sort of biographical element to it. Whatever events that bring about this conversion are part of this singular life history for each individual.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and then a couple questions here in the chat. This bit about Orphism, I also find it confusing. I'm not sure exactly where this comes from. I mean, I don't know Pascal very well. I've only read a little bit of his work, so I don't know if he does talk about Orphism somewhere, and maybe that would be why Simondon mentions it here, or it could just be Simondon bringing it up for some reason. So yeah, I don't have a good explanation for Orphism sort of appearing here. But I think Orphism here is sort of standing in for Greek religion in general, where we have a sort of or maybe not just Greek religion in general, but a kind of understanding of the world in which we can sort of achieve meaning through some sort of mediation with the world, so we can participate in the ideas, for example, in a sort of Neoplatonist context. We can sort of have a grasp of meaning through that participation. Whereas in Pascal's context, there's no way of achieving something like meaning through mediation with the world. There's a sort of radical meaninglessness to worldly affairs that we have to overcome by turning towards God. And so I think is that kind of contrast between a sort of pagan, in the most general sense, sort of way of getting meaning from the world, as opposed to this specifically Christian context where we only find meaning by overcoming the world or pointing beyond the world. And then also, 61 has pointed to this sort of strange line from Pascal that man is consequently reduced to himself. So there's a certain strangeness in that this reduction is seemingly taking whatever this process of reduction takes man as an input, and then the output is man again, and then so in what sense is it a reduction? And I think we can try to understand this in terms of how human beings sort of think of themselves and what they actually are. So we think of ourselves as and Pascal talks about how we put so much sort of effort and investment into what other people think about us. Like he talks about how people will sacrifice their lives for honor. Dueling was a thing in his time. If someone said something that offends your honor, you would challenge them to a duel and potentially be killed just to satisfy your honor. And so essentially, what other people think of you, and so we put more importance into what other people think about us than we do to actually preserving our own lives. So this sort of image that we have of ourselves as an entity that other people sort of acknowledge and recognize as having value and worth and so on is maybe the first part of that reduction. So in our sort of everyday life, when we're sort of absorbed in the world, we sort of have this image of ourselves as being valuable and recognized by others as being valuable and so on. And then in the experience of being alone with oneself, we are sort of reduced to what we actually are. We're no longer sort of what we think that we are in other people's eyes, a being with honor and dignity and so on. We're just left with ourselves, and that experience of being left alone with ourselves we feel it as a kind of reduction or a loss of everything that we thought we had when we consider ourselves as entities that others appreciate and so on. So I think maybe that's how we can understand this kind of reduction of the human being to itself. It's a kind of loss of that imaginary sort of aura or this imaginary representation of ourselves as beings with dignity and honor and so on. Okay, so let's go on to the Spinoza section. If someone else would like to read the first page or so.
I can read.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Susie.
Okay, you sure?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, is my mic okay?
Yeah, that's good.
All right, Spinoza. With Spinoza, the soul is a spiritual automaton if we consider the capacity of the understanding. In fact, there is a methodical sequence of truths that begins with clear and distinct ideas and reveals the boundless fruitfulness of the understanding through the creation of mathematics and physics. All knowledges unsuitable for this fruitfulness, all those that end in themselves and are placed side by side inert, are rejected. They cannot, in fact, serve to increase the forces of the understanding. These include knowledge through hearsay and knowledge through vague experience. Conversely, the knowledge through which an effect is deduced from its cause, and intuitive and certain knowledge, are fruitful knowledges. This fruitfulness is expressed in the knowledge of knowledge, which is method. Method is the idea of the idea, or the reflection on the true idea, insofar as this idea is an instrument or a rule for acquiring other knowledge. Addate vere ideae normem, according to the standard of a given true idea. The true idea has certainty in itself. Certainty is the objective essence of the thing, or the thing such as it is represented in the understanding. The fictive idea is recognized by its indetermination. It permits alternative. The true idea does not permit indetermination, for it contains the reason of everything that can be affirmed or denied concerning its object. This intrinsic characteristic that guarantees the form of the true is, for example, that of a well-adjusted mechanism, which, in the mind of its inventor, is a true idea when this mind distinctly conceives the connection of its parts, even if this mechanism is not realized. Similarly, in the mathematical sciences, the understanding has the capacity to form true ideas by starting with simple and therefore fully determined ideas, like extension, quantity, movement. The true idea is therefore that which allows the soul to be a spiritual automaton. Nevertheless, can this power of the intellect be applicable to the individual itself? For that, nature would have to be deducible in its totality, and yet the nature that the understanding deduces from the objective essence of the principle cannot be the series of singular things submitted to change, but only the series of fixed and eternal things. Serium rerum fixerum aeternarumque. Aeternarumque. That was a tough one. Latin. These fixed and eternal things are the set of laws that form, as the permanent structure of nature, the fixed essences and eternal truths, such as extension, the conservation of movement, the laws of mechanical shock in Descartes, and in Spinoza, the laws according to which all singular things happen and are arranged. They are particular essences, well-defined and determined truth. However, even the set of res fixae cannot be deduced. Quote, to conceive everything at once would far surpass the forces of the human understanding. Each of the res fixae is nothing but the link in a chain or the moment of a progress, not the part of a whole. One cannot therefore merely determine in the res fixae et aeternae the place of a human nature and of this singular essence that we ourselves are. The distinction between individual bodies is not a real distinction, but a modal distinction. Only imagined extension is composed of parts, the finite sum of which it is. For the understanding, extension is infinite and indivisible. Bodies are not component parts, but merely limitations. Extension is a principle of intelligibility. Bodies are modes of extension through which they are conceived. Substance is unique. It is deus sive natura. All the attributes of this substance have the capability to account for the modes that are in them. The intelligibility of the attributes of unique substance is the order according to which in each of these attributes the modes follow one after the other. Substance consequently becomes the root of the unique order deployed in each attribute. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. The rapport of substance to its attributes is therefore not a rapport of subject to predicate. God or nature is efficient cause, cause of essences as well as existences, self-cause or absolutely first cause acting according to the laws of nature, cause that is only effective through itself, and ultimately immanent cause. What results from this conception is that what could be called the complete automaton is merely the attribute, and not a finite mode of extension. Nothing in a finite mode is related to the eternal essence of the attribute. The existence of this finite mode that an individual body is finds its reason in other finite modes, in other bodies that have communicated movement to it, and, through their causality, actually make it what it is. In turn, these other finite modes have their reason in other finite modes, and so on ad infinitum. An individual body is nothing but a mass of extension, the parts of which are animated by movements that are in a certain rapport and are communicated from one part to the other in a proportion such that the body persists for a certain duration. Existence in duration is therefore existence as distinct from essence, and it belongs solely to the finite being which has the causality of its being outside it. For what is true of the modes of extension is also true of the modes of thought or ideas. According to the correspondence of the attributes, the order of the objects in thought reproduces the order of realities in extension. The finite mode does not possess eternity or the infinite enjoyment of infinitas, in which essence the finite
Uh,
mode.
let's
Okay,
stop here.
okay. Sorry, I was
Um,
looking for a paragraph break.
yeah, this is one of these 3-page paragraphs that Simondo loves to give us. Thanks. Yeah. So far, I think we've mostly like what Simondo has given us here is mostly just a summary of Spinoza in a fairly traditional sort of interpretation. We don't have a lot that is new, but I think yeah. So yeah, there's maybe one of the points that sort of stands out here is the treatment of knowledge in terms of fruitfulness, because fruitfulness is not exactly the. I don't think Spinoza ever uses that term exactly to describe the different kinds of knowledge, but he does make a strong distinction between, of course, the three kinds of knowledge in the ethics. So we have the first kind of knowledge is through the imagination. So it's either through hearsay. So in Spinoza's example, we learn a rule for calculating. We learn it in school and we memorize it and we sort of apply it by rote, but we have no understanding of why this rule works or anything like that. So this is the first kind of knowledge, and then also knowledge through experience is likewise an instance of the first kind of knowledge. So if we sort of try out the rule on a few different numbers and we find that it works, and then we just sort of assume that it applies generally, this is also an instance of the first kind of knowledge. And then the second kind of knowledge is knowledge through what Spinoza calls the common notions. So there are certain properties of entities like motion and figure and so on that are common to a variety of different entities. And if we apply our knowledge of these common properties to particular entities, we can deduce properties of the entities. So if I know that, for example, all triangles have angles equal to two right angles, and then I have some reason to believe, whether through perception or whatever, I know that this figure in front of me is a triangle, then I can deduce that the angles of this figure are equal to two right angles. And so this is rational knowledge, knowledge through deduction, the second kind of knowledge. And then the third kind of knowledge is much more sort of mysterious, exactly what we're meant to take it to be, but Spinoza describes it as a kind of intuitive knowledge. So we grasp the truth that say that the angles of this figure are equal to two right angles. We grasp it without the mediation of a deduction. We just grasp it immediately. or in the case of the calculation rule, we grasp that this rule is valid through this immediate knowledge, intuitive knowledge of the third kind. And eventually, in Book 5 of the Ethics, he described this third kind of knowledge as being, in some sense, the kind of knowledge that God has of himself or itself, whatever pronoun we want to use there. So when we have knowledge of the third kind, we are actually participating in the knowledge that God has of itself. Our knowledge is a part of the divine knowledge, and so these three kinds of knowledge have different roles to play in the sort of spiritual economy, I guess we could call it, the sort of system of principles and functions that form the human soul. And so they operate in different ways. And Simondon describes this difference as a difference of fruitfulness, which I think is a slightly different way of describing it than how Spinoza describes it. Yeah, there's an interesting comment here in the chat from Angus about would Simondon see the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics as an instance of Spinoza's first kind of knowledge. I think I would want to, and maybe I don't know if Simondon would make this distinction, but I think I would want to make the distinction between. So there's the Copenhagen interpretation as such, like the way that Bohr sort of sets out his version of how we should understand the quantum physics, and then there's the sort of like default interpretation of physicists who sort of assume, like many physicists sort of just assume the validity of something like the Copenhagen interpretation, but they never sort of question what exactly, or they never really think about foundational questions in any detail. They just sort of assume that someone else has figured it out or someone else is working on it. And the sort of famous slogan, "Shut up and calculate." So like, don't worry about all these foundational questions. Just use the quantum theory to predict various phenomena, which of course it's very good at. And you don't have to worry about any of the foundational issues. So yeah, this kind of approach, or this kind of way of working with the quantum theory would be an instance of the first kind of knowledge for Spinoza. It's something that we sort of learn from by hearsay. We learn that someone else has an interpretation that makes it all work, and we just sort of say, okay, yeah, that's fine. So I don't need to worry about it anymore. Someone else has solved this problem, so it's a kind of it's an instance of this first kind of knowledge, as opposed to someone who actually sort of works through the problem and comes up with a consistent approach to interpretation of quantum theory, would be something like the second kind of knowledge. And then the third kind of knowledge would be something much more difficult to achieve. It would be a kind of intuitive grasp of the working of quantum physics. So it'd be like an immediate perception of the truth of the particular interpretation of quantum physics that you're proposing. And one other bit here in the Spinoza discussion that I think is important to point out here is the way that Simondon takes the problem of the individual to be sort of a key issue for Spinoza, because we have knowledge in the true sense of the term, or the second and third kinds of knowledge, only of what is eternal. So we have our acquaintance with finite things is only a kind of imaginative experience of those entities. So entities produce effects on our bodies, and our minds are sort of parallel to our bodies and undergo transformations as well. And we have ideas, these mutilated ideas, as he calls them, so or sort of confused ideas of entities, but we don't have any true knowledge of the causes of these mutilated ideas. And so it's only in the second and third kinds of knowledge that we have knowledge of causes, and these kinds of knowledge are knowledge of something eternal. So the difficulty here is that it means that we don't have knowledge of ourselves as entities with a particular location in space and time and a particular duration of life and so on. Our singularity seems to be hard to grasp. We can't. It seems like we can't have a rational knowledge of ourselves as entities that are finite beings and that have a particular location in space and time. So yeah, this is sort of the problem of the individual for as far as Simondon sees it in Spinoza.
Do you think that this part at the bottom of the last page, where he talks about an individual body being nothing but a massive extension, parts of which are animated by movements that are in a certain rapport, is that I think for Spinoza, an individual, what makes an individual is this notion of the characteristic ratio of motion and rest, which, as I understand it, there are problems with that when you consider like acceleration, which changes the ratio of the quantity of motion to the quantity of rest in an individual. But obviously, I don't cease to be an individual every time I drive in a car, for instance.
Yeah, Spinoza's physics is a little bit difficult to figure out because so there's in the ethics in book 2 there's a set of principles of physics which he sets out, but he does so only for purposes of sort of understanding the human individual, and ultimately leading up to book 5, which is human freedom. So he doesn't sort of set out his own sort of system of physics in opposition to Descartes' system of physics in a sort of systematic way. He just sort of introduces as much physics as is necessary to understand the human body and what relation the human mind has to the human body. So yeah, he definitely criticizes Descartes' physics and the principles that Descartes sets out for understanding motion. But his alternative is not 100% clear. But yes, the formulation that Spinoza uses to explain what an individual body is that it consists of a certain ratio of motion and rest. And actually, there's an interesting so Martial Guerroux, who was a important French historian of philosophy. He argues that Spinoza, in this notion of the ratio of motion and rest, he was thinking of something like harmonic motion, so the oscillation of a pendulum, for example, and so there's a kind of oscillation or vibration of bodies. Each body has its own sort of characteristic frequency of oscillation or resonance or something like that, and this is what constitutes the body as an individual body, and so this is what's preserved in a body insofar as it undergoes various transformation. And so, like, Spinoza talks about how the human body, for example, is this very complicated ratio of different kinds of motion and rest, and it's constantly undergoing change. So, of course, you lose matter and you take in matter. So the actual physical particles that make up your body are undergoing change constantly, but there's a sort of general pattern or general resonance or structure that stays constant through that change. So yeah, we have to think of some kind of frequency of vibration or oscillation as being sort of the image of this ratio of motion and rest. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. Yeah, I don't know how much. I wanted to try to end earlier today, but I'm not sure if we're going to be able to finish the Spinoza part before the 2-hour mark. But yeah, let's go on and see how far we get. So if someone else would like to read the next page or so.
Let me read the next part, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah.
The finite mode that is the individual is characterized solely by a sufficiency, and as such it cannot be deduced immediately from the nature of the attribute of God, whose consequences are as eternal as himself. God is nothing but the remote cause of the individual. The individuality of a body is that of a machine whose different parts are arranged by exterior causes in such a way that they communicate movement according to a permanent order. An individual itself consists of other individuals, and the human body, in this sense, is a very complex machine made up of other machines. The soul, which begins and ends with the body, is the idea that is the attribute, though has no object other than the corporeal individual in act. This idea has its cause outside it in other finite modes of thought, corresponding to the modes of extension that are the causes of the body. It is the position and the formation of the existence of the body is as composite as the body itself, and the individuality of the soul, with the variety of perceptions that it comprehends, does not have a different nature from that of the body. Insofar as it is a finite mode, the soul can have nothing but inadequate ideas of the body and of itself, i.e., ideas that do not make known the cause or reason of the idea at the same time as the object of the idea. The individual being is unintelligible to itself due to its very nature. The soul is a detached and isolated fragment incapable of relating to the ensemble. It is in fact possible to pass from natura naturans to natura naturata, which consists in the modes, without leaving the eternal and the infinite. The constant quantity of movement is an eternal mode of extended attribute, eternal like the attribute itself, and an infinite mode because it indicates what is immutable in the phasis totius universi. There is necessarily a mode in the attribute thought and objectively contains the entire immutable order of nature. The infinite modes, therefore, have God as absolutely proximal cause, but they do not make us leave the eternal and the infinite. The individual, therefore, cannot be a microsm. This much?
Yeah, let's stop here for now. Thanks. Yeah, so there's this sort of strange notion that we find in Spinoza of these infinite modes. So the more sort of familiar notion of modes is the finite modes. So each of us as a human individual is a finite mode of a combination of extension and thought, and each of our bodies is composed of further modes. Each particle, each cell, each component of our body is a mode. But there's also these infinite modes that Spinoza doesn't say a lot about. But each attribute, so thought and extension, and the infinite other attributes that we have no knowledge of, each of those attributes sort of generates this infinite mode that. So when one of in one of the letters, one of Spinoza's correspondents asks for an explanation of what these infinite modes consist of, and Spinoza gives the answer for extension, that it's the face of the whole universe, the facies tosius universi. So there's a kind of the total ratio of motion and rest in the whole universe stays the same, even though there's a constant change happening of the distribution of the various parts of the universe. They're constantly undergoing change, but the total pattern stays the same, in the same way that the human body undergoes change, but the general pattern stays the same. So the whole universe is a kind of quasi-individual that stays the same despite all the changes of the component parts. And this is apparently what we're meant to understand by an infinite mode of in the attribute of extension. And then the attribute of thought is more obscure. I forget the exact wording that Spinoza uses for the attribute of thought, the infinite mode in the attribute of thought. So we should understand each attribute as having not just these finite modes that we're familiar with, like ourselves and tables and chairs and so on, but also these infinite modes, which are sort of a kind of configuration of the whole universe within that attribute.
This part makes me wonder first, like the difference between Descartes and then Spinoza. So in that Descartes, like as far as I understand, Descartes emphasizes some kind of something stable, something unchangeable, something fixed. Whereas like the Spinoza seems in a way like the kind of like a bring the idea of like the some kind of changing transformation of being possible. But I can't understand that is just limited to the individual, or it can be applied to the level of God. Because like the concept of extension, it's a little bit like confusing. Because extension, in a way, kind of seems applied to the each mode, an individual as a mode, but at the same time, it's like the level of God. Also, God is like the being which is extended as much as possible. Maybe I could be totally wrong. And then the next question is that the relation between like the individuality and the collectivity. So finite mode is like maybe applied to the only individual, but the infinite mode can be like for example, like at the collective level. Um, each kind of mode individuals like has its own finite mode, but at the end of the day, like it consists of like the infinite mode of God, something like that.
Yeah, those are some good questions. I think, yeah, so when we talk about extension, one key point to keep in mind is that for Spinoza, extension is not divisible. And so, like, this was one of the sort of objections that Descartes and others had used to say that God can't be characterized as an extended being because God is infinite. And so if you divided the infinite, you would have parts that are either so you divide the infinite into parts. So you have, say, two parts, part one and part two, and then either those parts are themselves infinite or they are finite, and either way leads to an absurdity. So if the parts of the infinite are themselves finite, then adding two finite parts creates something infinite, which is absurd. Or alternately, if the two parts of the infinite are themselves infinite, then we now have two infinites, which in the 17th century understanding of the infinite would also be absurd. So we either supposition about dividing the infinite leads to absurdity. And before Spinoza, this was generally taken as an argument against the possibility of God being extended. But then Spinoza actually takes this as an argument that extension is itself indivisible. So God is an entity, is an extended thing, or one of the attributes of God is extension, but only extension conceived of as something indivisible. So extension as a whole, the entirety of extension. And when we think about a particular space, so like the space of this room where I'm sitting now, that is divisible into parts, and then those parts are in turn divisible into further parts, and so on. But the extension as such is not something divisible. It's only components or parts of extended substance that are divisible. And so this is, I think, sort of the key point where Spinoza's conception of extension differs from Descartes, because for Descartes, extension is divisible, and that's why God can't, and the human soul as well, can't be extended. And then on that second point about the collective, I think that's a very important topic in Spinoza that Simondon doesn't really address. But there are these, and this comes up more in the theological political treatise and the political treatise, where Spinoza talks about the formation of a state, and he uses this phrase that is hard to translate, but it means something like, as it were, guided by a single mind. So he talks about how when a bunch of individuals, a bunch of human beings come together to form a state, they form a collective that is as if it's guided by a single mind. And so they sort of overcome their individuality, but at the same time, there's a kind of preservation of individuality as well, because Spinoza famously, or he's well known for defending freedom of thinking and freedom of speech as being key principles for a well-governed state. And so he thinks that a well-governed state has to preserve the sort of natural inclinations of individuals, what Spinoza in Latin he calls the ingenuum. So it's like the sort of character or natural inclinations of individuals. And if a state tries to sort of counter those natural inclinations of individuals, then it will necessarily lead to dissension and to strife and eventually civil war. And so there's like a well-governed state is one in which individuals can sort of pursue their natural inclinations and not be sort of subject to something that they find sort of counter to their natural inclinations. And so there's a kind of preservation of the individual, and then at the same time as there's a sort of surpassing of the individual in the collective. So there's it's a subtle kind of relationship between the individual and the collective in Spinoza that Simondon doesn't really talk about very much.
Okay, thank you.
So I think maybe this would be a good point to end, because I don't think we're going to be able to get through the Spinoza section today. Still a couple pages. And I do need to end early today. So let's stop here, unless anyone has any sort of final thoughts or questions on what we've read today.
No, thank you, though. I'm still stuck on Pascal. I'll work on Spinoza.
Right. Yeah, the Pascal section was there's a lot in that short section. So it's there's a lot to think about. So let's stop here. Let me put a note in the chat so I don't forget where we are. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming out, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you so much. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.